If God were to say, "Thou shalt not eat beans," that would be our moral duty, and we should obey it. That is his prerogative.
Oh, hello there. In this video, I'm going to analyze William Lane Craig's moral argument for God's existence, and I'm going to argue that it fails to justify its conclusion. Now, William Lane Craig is a philosopher and a prominent Christian apologist, and his moral argument goes something like this. If God does not exist, then neither does objective morality, but objective morality does exist, so God exists. Now, I'm going to argue that whatever you think of objective morality, whether you think it can be justified or not, this argument fails to justify its conclusion because its first premise is unjustified, namely the premise that objective morality really does require a God. I'll say a little bit about the second premise too, that objective morality does exist, but I won't really take a stand on whether or not it's justified. I'll also argue towards the end that William Lane Craig's version of the argument may even be question-begging or circular, and therefore clearly it won't give us good reason to believe in God. Now, in watching William Lane Craig defend this argument, it seems to me that he's not actually fair to either subjective morality or objective morality. He's not fair to subjective morality because he constantly conflates it with nihilism, the view that nothing is right or wrong. Or he acts as if there's only one version of subjective morality, which grounds morality in each individual's separate opinions. And he's not fair to objective morality because he assumes there's only one possible theory of objective morality, one that grounds morality in the nature of a divine being. However, once we notice that there are plenty of other versions of subjective morality and objective morality, it should be clear that this argument gives us no good reason to believe in God. Okay, let's get started. Now here's William Lane Craig expressing the moral argument on Ben Shapiro's show.
But the argument that they find, I think, the most compelling is what I call the moral argument. And it would go like this. One, if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. That is to say, in the absence of God, everything becomes socioculturally relative. Two, but objective moral values and duties do exist. There are some moral absolutes, some objective values and duties. Three, therefore, God exists.
So, here we have the moral argument. Premise M1, if God does not exist, then objective morality does not exist. Premise M2, but objective morality does exist. Conclusion, so God exists. Now in the video, William Lane Craig said objective values and duties, but I'm just going to abbreviate that as objective morality. Okay? This includes moral properties, such as rightness and wrongness, goodness and badness, and alleged moral facts, such as abortion is wrong or abortion is not wrong, that sort of thing. So taking a look at the argument, let's first notice that the argument is valid. Okay? The premises do entail the conclusion. In fact, if there's one good thing I can say about William Lane Craig, it's that his arguments are always valid. But a question we should ask ourselves when looking at this argument is, what does objective mean here? Okay? Now, here's my interpretation of objective, and I think William Lane Craig would be okay with it. Independent of anyone's opinion, preference, perspective, or something like that. Okay? So objective morality is morality that doesn't depend on anyone's opinion, preference, perspective, etc. We'll soon see that this seems to be what he has in mind by the word objective. However, at times it seems like William Lane Craig doesn't actually believe in objective morality himself. He thinks that morality does depend on someone's opinion, preference, perspective, etc., namely God's. But he's not always totally clear on the matter. Okay, now as I said before, I'm going to be challenging this first premise M1, and I'm going to argue that we've got no good reason to accept it. I think one problem is William Lane Craig thinks premise M1 is so obvious that he spends most of his time discussing the second premise, M2. In fact, in the entire hour-long interview with Ben Shapiro, he doesn't defend the first premise even once. He just constantly reasserts it over and over, as if it's obvious. I hope it will become clear soon that it's certainly not obvious. Perhaps part of the problem is that the people he encounters often accept the first premise and argue about the second one, But I hope one takeaway you get from this video is that you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't grant this first premise, okay? We've got no good reason to accept it. You should definitely challenge this one, no matter what you think about objective morality. In addition to undermining this argument for God's existence, I think there's another benefit to challenging this first premise. And that's because William Lane Craig and other apologists often use this first premise to deflect any moral criticism to them or to their religion. For instance, in this clip, Ben Shapiro asked William Lane Craig about the common criticism of the Bible that it contains immoral or morally backward passages. For instance, its views on homosexuality.
Now, the first thing you mentioned, I've forgotten.
Homosexual marriage, same-sex marriage.
With respect to some of these other moral questions, I think we need to remember the first premise of the moral argument. If there is no God, then there are no objective moral values and duties. Everything is socioculturally relative. So who's to say that the moral values of a society that discriminates against people and oppresses people is worse than one which is liberal and tolerant? We just sort of assume that the liberal values are the ones that would be objective, when in fact they're just as relativistic as any of the other ones on atheism.
William Lane Craig and other apologists love to make this move. They argue that atheists are not in a position to make any moral criticism of them, their God, or their book. However, you shouldn't let them get away with this move, since it's based upon an unjustified premise, or so I'll argue. Okay, so let's take a look at the first premise, M1, or what I call the conditional premise. This premise says, if God does not exist, then objective morality does not exist. Now, why should we accept this premise? It certainly isn't obvious, no matter what William Lane Craig seems to think. Well, here's an argument schema in defense of it, okay? Here's the structure of an argument for this claim that contains some blanks, and then we can fill in the blanks to get an argument for it. Premise C1, objective morality exists only if there exists blank. Premise C2, there exists blank only if God exists. Conclusion, so if God does not exist, objective morality does not exist. Okay, so premise C1 is stating a necessary condition for the existence of objective morality, right? Objective morality exists only if there exists blank. Blank is necessary for objective morality. And then the second premise, C2, says God's existence is a necessary condition for blank's existence. In other words, without God, you've got no blank. So now to turn this schema into an actual argument for M1, we're going to have to fill in this blank here. Now, like I said, in William Lane Craig's interview with Ben Shapiro, which I watched many times, he doesn't defend this premise even once. So I had to look elsewhere for a defense of this premise. There's a short 5-minute video on a channel associated with William Lane Craig, and this video contains a defense of this premise. So let's take a look.
See, here's the problem. If there is no God, what basis remains for objective good or bad, right or wrong? If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. And here's why. Without some objective reference point, we have no way of saying that something is really up or down. God's nature provides an objective reference point for moral values. It's the standard against which all actions and decisions are measured. But if there's no God, there's no objective reference point. All we're left with is one person's viewpoint, which is no more valid than anyone else's viewpoint. This kind of morality is subjective, not objective. It's like a preference for strawberry ice cream. The preference is in the subject, not the object. So it doesn't apply to other people.
Okay, so I think this clip gives us some idea for how to fill in the blank here. All right, so that brings us to the argument for the conditional premise. This is the main argument he has in mind. I'm going to consider a follow-up argument after this. Okay, premise C1, objective morality exists only if there exists a basis or standard for morality other than someone's opinion, preference, perspective, etc. Premise C2, there exists a basis or standard for morality other than someone's opinion, preference, perspective, etc., only if God exists. Conclusion, so if God does not exist, objective morality does not exist. Now, C1 is pretty plausible, and it may even be true by definition, right? Objective morality requires a basis or standard for morality other than someone's opinion, preference, perspective, etc. That's just what it is to be objective, okay? So we can accept C1. However, we've got no good reason to accept C2, okay? So premise C2 says there exists a basis or standard for morality other than someone's opinion, preference, perspective, etc., only if God exists. Okay? So the existence of God is supposed to be a necessary condition for the existence of a basis or standard for morality other than someone's opinion, preference, perspective, etc. Now, to see that this is false, let's brainstorm some possible candidates for a basis or standard for morality. Okay? So here's one. Morality could depend on people's opinions, preference, perspectives, etc. This would obviously make morality subjective, right? Here's another one. Morality could be based on the nature or the will or the mind of a divine being. This is the moral view that William Lane Craig has in mind. But here's some other possible bases or standards. Pain or pleasure, or happiness and suffering, autonomy, freedom, equality, etc., or some complex combination of several of these things. Okay? Now, with this list in front of us, I think it becomes clear that William Lane Craig is just making a false dichotomy. He's saying, look, there are only two possible candidates for a basis or standard for morality, namely people's opinions, preferences, or perspectives, the first one up here, or the nature or will or mind of a divine being, the second one up here, right? Now, if those really are the two options, then this premise would be correct, right? If there's no God, if there's no divine being, then the second candidate is out, so we have to go with the first candidate, people's opinions, preferences, perspectives, etc. But those are not the only two options, right? We have a whole host of other options, plus a lot more that aren't even listed here, okay? Morality could be a function of promoting happiness or avoiding suffering. It can be a function of respecting autonomy, promoting freedom, equality, etc. Or it could be a function of balancing several of these features to the right extent. We've got no reason to think that the first two are the only real options here. So I think it's pretty clear that William Lane Craig is basing this premise, C2, on a false dichotomy. The idea that the only options are subjective morality, morality based on someone's opinion, preference, perspective, etc., or theistic morality, morality based on God's nature, will, mind, etc. Now here's another clip that suggests he is really making this false dichotomy.
But if atheism is true, there is no ultimate standard. So there can be no moral obligations or duties. Who or what lays such duties upon us? No one.
Now, if we assume that duties have to be laid upon us by someone, then perhaps the only options are God or our own opinions. Okay? But we've got no reason to accept this dichotomy. It's just an assertion. There are plenty of other options, as this list makes clear. So how might William Lane Craig respond to this? Well, I predict that he'd say, even with these other candidates, you still need a God. Now, why is that? Well, perhaps we need a God to know which of these candidates is the correct one. However, my response to this is, whether or not moral knowledge is possible, and if so, how do we attain it? That's a difficult question that moral philosophers are working on. It would be nice if we just had an omniscient being that could tell us the truth about any matter whatsoever without us doing the hard work. But more realistically, it seems like we just have to do moral philosophy to come to moral knowledge, the same way we have to do mathematics or science to come to mathematical or scientific knowledge. It's not clear why we need an easy shortcut through a divine being. Now, William Lane Craig might instead say, God is not required for us to know which of these candidates is correct, but God's required to make one of these candidates the correct one. And to this I would ask, well, how? Is it God's opinion or preference or perspective that's making one of these candidates correct? Well, that can't be it. Otherwise, that would be a version of subjective morality, right? That would be morality that depends on someone's opinion, preference, or perspective, namely God's. Okay, so that can't be it. Could it be that we instead need God's nature to determine which of these candidates is correct? Well, that's just a confusion. That would just be swapping out one standard for another. Instead of happiness or autonomy being the ultimate standard, it'd once again just be God's nature. That's not taking seriously the proposal that it's happiness or autonomy or freedom that's the ultimate standard. In other words, Morality just is about promoting happiness, or freedom, or respecting autonomy, or something like that. William Lane Craig thinks morality is ultimately just about conforming to God's nature, so why can't it instead be ultimately about one of these other things? I see no reason to think that God's nature is the only real option. In fact, as we'll soon see, I think any of these other options are a lot more plausible than the standard based on God's nature. Now, if William Lane Craig really did make this objection, in other words saying that you need God to make one of these standards correct, I think he'd just be guilty of circular reasoning. He'd be arguing that God is the only possible standard for objective morality because you need God as a standard for objective morality. That's clearly circular. Furthermore, William Lane Craig's own view, that God's nature is the ultimate standard, would be subject to this exact same objection. What makes God's nature the correct standard? Do you need some other standard to make God's nature the correct standard? And what's the standard that makes that standard correct? And so on and so forth. Is it just that God's standard is correct according to God's standard? Well, that's hardly a plausible view. I mean, Donald Trump's standard is correct according to Donald Trump's standard. That doesn't mean much. Now, perhaps William Lane Craig just doesn't find any of these alternative theories based on these other standards plausible. That's fine. Welcome to how I feel about his theory. I think it's worth taking a moment here to look at the details of his own theory, just so we can see how implausible it is. Here's a short clip of the divine nature theory explained.
God has expressed his moral nature to us as commands. These provide the basis for moral duties. For example, God's essential attribute of love is expressed in his command to love your neighbor as yourself. This command provides a foundation upon which we can affirm the objective goodness of generosity, self-sacrifice, and equality. And we can condemn as objectively evil greed, abuse, and discrimination. God is the standard of moral values, just as a live musical performance is the standard for a high-fidelity recording.
Without your love.
The more a recording sounds like the original, the better it is. Likewise, the more closely a moral action conforms to God's nature, the better it is.
So the idea behind this theory is that rightness and wrongness is a function of how well our actions conform to the divine nature. But not only is this not the only possible theory of objective morality, it's not even a very plausible one. To see this, suppose that God's nature were different. Suppose that instead of being peaceful and loving and selfless, God were actually violent and hateful and selfish. Would that change the morality of actions? Would that make rape, discrimination, and greed suddenly right? Well, the theory seems to imply that, but that's super implausible to me, and I expect many of you to find that super implausible. Now, perhaps William Lane Craig would object here, look, you can't change God's nature. God's nature is unchanging, essential, necessary. God is necessarily peaceful, loving, selfless, etc. Now, I do think this is what he would say here. However, we can get around this objection. Suppose that all of the experts on God, right, priests, philosophers of religion, theologians, biblical scholars, etc., came to you and gave you compelling evidence that God's nature is entirely different than what we thought, right? They gave us compelling evidence that God is actually violent and hateful and selfish. Would that then give us good reason to think morality is super different from what we thought? That rape, discrimination, and greed is suddenly good? Again, that's super implausible. I expect most of you to agree. Now let's do the same thing with these other standards, whichever ones you find most plausible, right? If the impact of our actions on happiness or freedom or equality were different, would that change the morality of some of these actions? Well, I think it's somewhat plausible that it would, at least more plausible than the God case. Similarly, if you change the facts about autonomy, which beings have autonomy, or when they exercise this autonomy, would that change the morality of certain arrangements, right? If someone with rational autonomy consents to an arrangement versus if they don't consent, that can certainly make a difference to the morality of the arrangement, okay? So virtually any of these other alternative standards seem much more plausible as a basis or standard for objective morality than God's nature does, at least to me. And I expect most of you, once again, to agree. Now, to further support how implausible William Lane Craig's theory is, I want to show you another clip in which he seems to embrace some of the bizarre implications of his view.
So if we need God to be the anchor point for objective moral values and duties, we cannot escape the question, when thinking of moral right and wrong, well, what does God think of this? And if God proscribes something, it seems to me that's entirely within his right. If God were to say, thou shalt not eat beans, or thou shalt not eat pork, that would be our moral duty, and we should obey it. That is his prerogative as the moral lawgiver and the supreme good. And so if God says, my plan for human sexuality is heterosexual marriage, that's his prerogative. And there is no basis for calling that, I think, into question.
Now, I think this makes it clear how implausible the view is, right? Now, the thou shalt not eat beans quote is kind of funny, but let's replace it with something a lot less funny. Suppose God were to say, thou shalt rape and torture as much as you like. Would that then be our duty? Well, William Lane Craig might have to say that it would. Now, he'd probably object and say God would never command this because it goes against his nature, and morality is ultimately based on God's nature. But again, we can do what we did before, right? Suppose we got compelling evidence that God's nature is significantly different than what we thought, such that the command, thou shalt rape and torture as much as you like, actually is in conformance with that nature. Would that then be our duty? I expect almost everyone to agree that it wouldn't. Perhaps not William Lane Craig, which is actually a little bit scary. Now, in that clip there, it also becomes less clear that William Lane Craig is really committed to objective morality. If morality depends on what God thinks, or on God's perspective, as was suggested by that earlier clip, then in what sense is this still objective? However, being charitable, I think we can assume he still has his divine nature theory in mind, and so it's not really God's thoughts determining morality, but it's God's nature. Either way, the view is still pretty implausible. Okay, so whatever you think about these alternative standards, right, basing morality on happiness and suffering, or respecting autonomy, or freedom, or something like that, I think it's clear that we've got no good reason to accept C2. This premise is just based on a false dichotomy, that the only two options for morality are someone's opinion, preference, or perspective, or God's nature, will, or mind. Those are certainly not the only two options, and so we should reject C2. And so if we reject C2, that undermines our reason for believing in the first premise of the moral argument. If God does not exist, then objective morality does not exist. We've got no reason to think that objective morality really does require a God. Now, I'm also going to go over a follow-up argument that's given in that little cartoon video, but it's not even clear what role this argument is supposed to play in relation to the moral argument. But let's take a look.
Remember, for the atheist, humans are just accidents of nature, highly evolved animals. But animals have no moral obligations to one another. When a cat kills a mouse, it hasn't done anything morally wrong. The cat's just being a cat. If God doesn't exist, we should view human behavior in the same way. No action should be considered morally right or wrong.
Okay, so this argument seems to go something like this. Premise F1, if God does not exist, then humans are animals. Premise F2, nothing an animal does can be right or wrong. Conclusion, so if God does not exist, then nothing a human does can be right or wrong. Now, it's not clear what's meant by this first premise F1, since even if God does exist, humans are still animals. But maybe the idea is if God does not exist, humans are mere animals. They don't have a divine spark or a soul or anything like that. So we can grant this premise. However, we've got no good reason to accept premise F2, right? Being subject to moral criticisms is a function of whether you have the relevant sort of agency, not whether or not you're an animal, okay? Some animals, like cats and dogs and cows and rats, don't have the relevant sort of agency, so they're not subject to moral criticism. However, humans, a different sort of animal, arguably do have the relevant sort of agency, okay? Perhaps there are some alien species out there that also have the relevant sort of agency. So we've got no good reason to accept premise F2. Furthermore, it's not even clear that a theist, right, a God believer, should accept premise F2. Whether or not you have a duty is a matter of whether God gives you one. So God presumably could give duties to animals if they chose to. So I don't even think a theist needs to accept this argument. Also notice that the conclusion in this argument isn't even the first premise in the moral argument. Right? This conclusion says, if God does not exist, nothing a human does can be right or wrong. That's a different claim than saying if God does not exist, then objective morality does not exist. Right? This argument seems to be making a stronger claim that if God does not exist, there's no morality whatsoever, or perhaps humans are not subject to it. So like I said, it's not clear what role this argument is supposed to play, but I thought it's worth briefly discussing it. Okay, let's go back to the moral argument as a whole. Right? If God does not exist, then objective morality does not exist. No good reason to accept that premise. Premise 2, objective morality does exist, so God exists. Now I want to talk a little bit about this second premise, premise M2. Now, I'm going to call this the affirmative premise because it's affirming the existence of objective morality. Now, in this video, I won't take a stand on whether or not we should accept this premise. I actually think the case for objective morality is pretty complicated, a lot more complicated than either proponents or opponents often admit. But I do want to criticize some of the things that William Lane Craig says in defense of this premise. Now, here's a clip from which we'll extract William Lane Craig's main argument for this premise.
But the problem is, good and bad, right and wrong do exist. Just as our sense experience convinces us that the physical world is objectively real, our moral experience convinces us that moral values are objectively real. Every time you say, "Hey, that's not fair, that's wrong, that's an injustice," you affirm your belief in the existence of objective morals.
Okay, so here's my reconstruction of the argument. I call this the argument from moral experience. Premise E1, we have an experience as of objective morality. Premise E2, if we have an experience as of objective morality, then objective morality does exist. Conclusion, so objective morality does exist. Okay, now the phrase as of, as used in both premises, is meant to indicate that the experience might not be accurate. If you take the right sort of drugs, you can have an experience as of a pink elephant in your living room without there actually being a pink elephant in your living room. The second premise here is essentially saying that if we do have this experience, then it is accurate. Now, I won't say too much about the second premise here. William Lane Craig tries to defend it by analogy with physical experience, right? He says, just as your physical experience gives you good reason to believe that objective physical reality exists, your moral experience gives you good reason to think objective moral reality exists. Now, obviously, to defend this premise, you're going to want to defend that analogy. And to challenge this premise, you're probably going to want to challenge that analogy. You might try to point out some ways in which physical experience and moral experience are disanalogous. Maybe we've got some special reason for thinking that our moral experience is not accurate or illusory. But I won't say anything more about the premise here. Instead, I want to comment on premise E1, right? Premise E1 says we have an experience as of objective morality. Now, in various clips, William Lane Craig tries to give us some reason for thinking that we really do have an experience as of objective morality. Now, he may ultimately be correct, but I do want to criticize some of the things he says because I don't think he's always fair to subjective morality. Now, here are some ways he tries to support this premise, okay? He says we have experience as of the following. Here's one clip.
Every time you say, "Hey, that's not fair, that's wrong, that's an injustice," you affirm your belief in the existence of objective morals.
In other words, we experience some actions as being right or wrong, fair or unfair, just or unjust. But this alone doesn't entail a commitment to objective morality, right? Subjective morality is different from nihilism. Nihilism is the view that nothing is right or wrong, fair or unfair, just or unjust. Subjective morality doesn't say this. According to subjective morality, things really are right or wrong, fair or unfair, just or unjust. It's just that the having of these features is dependent on someone's opinion, preference, perspective, etc. So he was just conflating subjective morality with moral nihilism. So this gives us no reason that we really do experience objective morality. Here's another thing he says.
Every day you get up, you answer by how you treat other people, whether you regard them as having intrinsic moral value or whether they are mere means to be used for your ends.
In other words, he says that we experience that people are more than just a mere means to our ends. However, once again, subjective morality doesn't necessarily entail this. Okay? Maybe there are some versions of subjective morality that entail this, namely a version that grounds morality in whatever goal each individual happens to have at a given time. But there are other possible versions. There are theories of subjective morality that make morality depend not on our actual preferences, but on the preferences we would have if we were idealized in certain ways, if we were unbiased or more open-minded or could think more clearly. And it's not clear that such a view entails that each person is a mere means to anyone else's end. Furthermore, there are versions of subjective morality that ground morality not in each individual's preferences, but in our collective preferences, or the preference set we would all converge on after a process of ideal deliberation, something like that. Again, it's not clear that this version would entail that each person is just a mere means to anyone else's end. Alright, now here's another thing he says.
The man who says that it is morally acceptable to rape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says 2 + 2 = 5.
In other words, some moral claims are just mistaken, just like 2 + 2 = 5 is mistaken. Now for this one, we have to be pretty careful. If he's claiming that we have an experience of some moral claims being mistaken in the exact same way that certain mathematical claims are mistaken, then perhaps it does support an experience of objective morality. Actually, I think there might be some views in the philosophy of mathematics which deny the objectivity of mathematics as well. But I don't know much about that, so I'm going to set that aside. However, if the claim is just that we have an experience of some moral claims as being mistaken, then this doesn't require objective morality. Subjective morality doesn't entail that no moral claims are correct or mistaken. Instead, it just entails that whether these claims are correct or mistaken depends on someone's opinion, preference, perspective, etc. For instance, a moral claim can be mistaken relative to one's framework or perspective, or maybe the framework or perspective as a whole can be inconsistent and therefore mistaken. So even if we do have an experience of some moral claims being mistaken, that doesn't necessarily support an experience of objective morality. Finally, here's one last thing he says.
We're well aware that child abuse, racial discrimination, and terrorism are wrong for everybody, always. Is this just a personal preference or opinion? No.
In other words, we have an experience that some actions are wrong for everybody, always. Now, perhaps this one really does require objective morality, but once again, I'm not totally sure about that. We have to keep in mind that there are countless versions of subjective morality that try to accommodate our moral experience. As I said earlier, there are versions of subjective morality which ground morality not in the individual's preferences or perspective, but in our collective preferences or perspective, or the ones we would converge on after a process of ideal moral deliberation. It's not obvious whether this version of subjective morality is actually inconsistent with this final claim here, that some actions are wrong for everybody always. Maybe it ultimately is, but I think we have to keep an open mind and think carefully about it. So I think in looking at the ways that William Lane Craig tries to support E1, I think it's not always obvious that all of these are actually inconsistent with morality being subjective rather than objective. However, I don't really intend to challenge premise E1 too much. Maybe ultimately it can be defended. My only intention here is to show that in defending it, William Lane Craig is not always fair to subjective morality. He constantly assumes that subjective morality has certain commitments that it may not actually have, and sometimes he just conflates it with straight-up moral nihilism. Now, you might ultimately be able to construct an argument that subjective morality somehow leads to nihilism, but this claim is certainly not obvious, and we shouldn't assume it's true absent a careful consideration of such an argument. Okay, now there's one more argument I want to look at before we finish. Suppose we consider a more specific version of the moral argument that goes like this. Premise W1, if God does not exist, then morality based on the divine nature does not exist. Premise W2, but morality based on the divine nature does exist. Conclusion, so God exists. Now, if this more specific argument is what William Lane Craig has in mind when presenting his moral argument, then it would explain why he thinks the first premise is just so obvious, that morality requires a God. We can actually grant this first premise here, right? If God does not exist, then morality based on the divine nature doesn't exist. Obviously, you need a divine being for the morality based on a divine nature. However, I think this version of the argument is actually question-begging or circular. Okay? I think it assumes in the premises what it purports to show in the conclusion. We've got no good reason to accept W2 unless we already have a reason to believe that God exists. Right? We've got no good reason to think morality based on the divine nature exists unless we already have good reason to believe in the divine nature. To further show how problematic this argument is, consider the following analogy. Suppose, for whatever silly reason, someone became convinced that the only possible theory of morality was the following. Actions are right if and only if they conform to the rules written on a door in a certain bathroom stall in a secret colony on Mars. Okay, it's a pretty weird view. Suppose someone became as convinced of it as William Lane Craig is convinced of his divine nature view. Would it then be possible to argue that this bathroom stall and the secret colony on Mars really exists because some actions seem right or wrong? Well, certainly not, right? You need to already know that this bathroom stall and the secret colony on Mars exists in order to know that some actions are right or wrong in this sense, in the sense of conforming to what's written there. Similarly, you need to already know that God exists in order to know that some actions are right or wrong in the sense of conforming to God's nature. So that's why I think the moral argument, or William Lane Craig's version of it, is simply circular. Even if we grant the first premise, it gives us no good reason to believe in God. We have to already have a good reason to believe in God. Okay, let's look at the main argument one more time. Okay, the moral argument, here it is. If God does not exist, then objective morality does not exist, but objective morality does exist, so God exists. Now, whether or not you think objective morality can ultimately be justified, this argument fails to justify its conclusion because we've got no good reason to accept the first premise, that objective morality really does require a God. So the moral argument gives us no good reason to believe in God. You're going to have to look elsewhere for an argument for God's existence. Now, if you think you have another compelling one, then I wish you good fortune in the culture wars to come. And now it begins.